Hello there, Jodi Kantor.
Hi, Glenn.
I am so glad that you're willing to come on the Glenn Show and talk to me about your book, The Obamas. Let me introduce you as Jodi Kantor, author of the exciting new book about the first family, The Obamas, and also correspondent for the New York Times. Thanks for joining us, Jodi.
I'm really happy to be with you.
So, how's the book doing?
The book is, it's been a fantastic experience. I've been traveling around the country, talking with different audiences, and
yes.
The thing that is really gratifying now is that people are actually reading the book. There was a couple of days after the book was first released when there was sort of all of this cable TV discussion about it, but people hadn't actually looked at it, and it was strange for me because I did see some of my reporting taken out of context or distorted, and now people seem to have a much more realistic picture of what the book is about. And it really, I wrote it, I've been covering the Obamas for 5 years for the New York Times, and I really wrote it to answer a question I thought we would all have going into the 2012 election, which is what happened to these two people in the White House, and what happens when you take two pretty regular people who are kind of not captives of the political world, two Chicagoans, very talented, very ambitious, but people who are pretty connected to real life, and put them in the White House, and what's the transition process of becoming president and first lady. What I was beginning to see in my reporting was that there was a lot of behind-the-scenes adjustment to those jobs taking place, and so that's really what the book is about.
Yeah, but you say that initially the book's reception kind of missed the mark as to what the book was about. First of all, how could that have been a surprise to you, given the kind of media culture in which we live and the, sensitivity and provocativeness of the topic? But secondly, how did that get straightened out if you say by now people are beginning to see what you were really trying to get after in the book? What happened? So there are two questions there.
Sure. Well, I think the surprise to me was because I've been writing these sort of sensitive personal stories about the Obamas for the New York Times for a number of years, since 2007. And so to me, this seemed a lot like a continuation of the work that I had been doing a long time and following the same themes. And I think, I think that as an author, you can be blessed and cursed with a lot of attention. And I don't want to complain about the fact that the book made a big splash when it came out. But one of the things that happens with a political book, and as you say, the media culture is extremely intense, is that a lot of other publications, a lot of TV shows and whatnot will take just a little bit of your reporting, and do a kind of very quick 2-minute story on that. So that's a lot of what was happening. And it is sort of antithetical to what a book really is, because the entire reason to write a book is about context, about deep reporting, about really exploring subjects, about watching, if you're writing a biographical book, which this was, it's really about watching the people you're reporting on change. And so in a way, it's only possible to get to those themes by really looking at the book itself, or by having a long conversation like the one you and I are going to have today.
Okay. Well, why don't we get that conversation started with you telling us a little bit about, what you see with your years of reporting to have been the principal insights or, kind of conclusions that you come to from this reporting. What have we learned about the Obamas over your years since 2007?
Well, I think one of the main things that readers will walk away thinking about is really what a profound change they've been through, and the way that their journey has affected every aspect of their lives. Becoming president and first lady is not something that happens in a snap on Inauguration Day. It's a slow and sometimes painful process. And, the book kind of goes back and forth between the stories of the president and the first lady in the White House. And the first lady according to aides and friends, had a pretty hard landing in the White House. When she got there, she was really a newcomer. I mean, she had been a hospital executive in Chicago, leading a pretty regular life, and all of a sudden she finds herself the First Lady of the United States. And the challenges she confronted were really pretty formidable. It's not a well-defined role. She had to kind of create it from scratch. She initially had a tense relationship with some of her husband's advisors for different reasons. Also, the confinement and isolation of the presidency is really profound. I even included maps and floor plans in the book because the White House, the physical White House, is almost a character in the book because, you know, the Obamas are constantly dealing with the question of what is this place? Is it a home? Is it a museum? Is it an office? Is it a terrorist target?
Well, you know,
all
if
of
I could
these
just
things
say,
and those functions are bumping into each other.
Yeah, I just wanted, sorry to interrupt, but I was struck by one passage in the book where you report that the president on the inauguration night, after all the balls had been attended and they had repaired back to the White House with friends for the real party, and Michelle had gone to bed early and the president had stayed up late savoring. And as he gets ready to go to bed and turns to go to the White House, to the residence, he doesn't know where to go.
Exactly. Exactly. And, you know, it goes to kind of this strange combination of power and powerlessness in the presidency, right? I mean, I always think about the fact that, you know, Barack Obama revolutionized online campaigning in 2008, and yet when he got to the White House, he had to give up his BlackBerry, and he could only email with a few people. And, you know, there are good reasons for those restrictions. Obviously, we don't want the President of the United States' emails hacked, and yet you take a step back and you say, how is it that we allow, you know, any 17-year-old in this country to use an iPhone and communicate with whoever he or she wishes, and yet we don't allow the President of the United States to do that?
Yeah. Now, you say the impact of the dramatic change on this couple who were close to being ordinary people and found themselves in this amazing situation. But what about the impact of their personal dynamic on the exercise of their public responsibilities? I suppose it has to be a two-way street, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and that's another major theme of the book. To me, the strange thing about the presidency is how intensely personal it is, and, you know, ideas and quirks and beliefs and habits that Barack Obama has that probably wouldn't really matter that much if he was in a regular job have consequences for the rest of us. When you're the president and first lady, even little things you do can have an enormous impact on the nation. And I think that also goes to the theme of, you know, the question of what is public and private in this world. I mean, the book talks about the fact that Michelle and Barack Obama had their own, you know, kind of intense conversations about healthcare reform in the summer of 2009 and whether the American people understood the kind of president's message and what he was trying to do. And that one of the things that I discovered in my reporting is that Michelle Obama has been an influence in the administration, especially early on, in encouraging her husband to take on big, ambitious, but politically risky projects like healthcare reform. And so, you know, on the one hand, the two of them are having those kinds of private conversations, and on the other hand, they're back and forth, you know, and with the Obamas, we could even call it their dialectic, because they've had some long-running debates over the years, has an impact on the rest of us.
What kind of access did you have to the Obamas over this period, I wonder?
So the White House cooperated with the book. They gave me lots and lots of interviews. I spent a lot of time talking to people like Valerie Jarrett, Susan Scherer, David Axelrod, Robert Gibbs, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of access to the Obamas, I think it's pretty much the same story that every journalist has, which is that it's extremely difficult to get direct access to them. My colleagues at the Times who cover the president day to day, I think, have had one, maybe two sit-downs with him since inauguration, and they had one, I think, during the campaign. So I had a big interview with the Obamas in 2009. We actually sat in the Oval Office for 40 minutes and talked about their marriage. And so what I did is that really became a jumping off point for my reporting for the book.
Oh, I see. And did you have more access to Michelle than you did to the president himself?
No, the First Lady does not do book interviews. It's kind of a rule of hers. And one thing that advisors say is that she really wants to save her kind of memories and insights for her own memoirs. But I am the first book author to be given access to the East Wing. And so I had a lot of interviews with her team, the people who worked on Let's Move, which is the childhood obesity initiative, and Joining Forces, the military families initiative, and all the different team members who kind of helped her build her first ladyhood from scratch. I think that's one thing, by the way, about the book that hasn't really been represented in some of the coverage, is that that one of the main storylines of the book is really sort of about watching her create this job out of nothing.
Yeah. It must have been tough for her at the start. You seem to suggest that she stumbled and then sort of got her footing after a while. How did that go?
Well, she was just so new to the White House. One of the things I reported is that she actually considered staying back in Chicago for a little longer with her kids. She wondered whether they should finish out the school year and then move to Washington over the summer after inauguration. And I actually start the book with, a scene of her talking to a friend about that. And the reason I do is that, to me, it gives us so much insight into what she's like, and especially what she was like, right around Election Day. She's kind of standing on that precipice between one world and the next. And you could say two things about her kind of hesitation to move to the White House. On the one hand, you could say, okay, this is somebody who is pretty new to the presidency, because the nation probably would not have liked the idea of a commuter first lady. And so many people were enthralled by the idea of this particular family
being in
moving into the White House. Yeah. Exactly. But on the other hand, you could also say that there was a little bit of outsider wisdom to it, because this is not house that's easy to live in with two young kids. The Obamas are kind of never allowed to complain, because obviously they do lead lives of such great privilege in many ways. But there's a terrifying aspect to living in the White House. I mean, if you remember that news story a couple of months ago about a bullet hitting the back of the White House, that was really shocking. Nothing is supposed to penetrate there. And that lawn is where White House officials walk. It's where tourists walk. It's where Malia and Sasha kick a soccer ball.
Yeah.
So in terms of her hesitation, you could also say, well, even though she wasn't a kind of insider who knew the White House well, she had, there was some kind of spidey sense there where she saw that this was not going to be easy.
Well, I have to tell you personally, I was eager to see this family in the White House, and would have been deeply disappointed that, the public pageantry of this young, lovely African-American family, occupying this titular position of, sort of chief family for the nation and performing for my entertainment and edification. I would be shocked if I were to have been deprived of that. Is that unfair of me? I mean, look at all of the burden that's loaded onto these people, because they are, a symbol of so much for so many of us.
Well, one of the things I really explored in my reporting is, I wanted to ask the question, what is it like to be the first African-American president and first lady, not on a kind of existential level, because I think that's almost impossible to digest. The president himself has said in interviews that it's kind of too big for him to process. But really, what is that everyday experience like? I think of the Obamas kind of, hacking a path, through the jungle that has never been trodden before. And it's all the more dramatic because the situation in this country is that we've always been a very diverse country, but we've never had diverse leadership. And so, it's not like you could say, oh, there was that Latino American president and there was that Asian American president beforehand.
Yeah. You talk.
So one of the.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So what I was just going to.
Well, I was just going to say that to me, one of the stories that really goes to this, that's in the book, is about when Michelle Obama was invited to appear on the cover of Vogue, and there was a very interesting debate among her advisors. And I like telling the story because I think it's very hard, to sort of judge who was right here, because both sides had such good claims. So she's invited to do the cover of Vogue, and her group of female advisors splits by race on the issue, which is very uncomfortable for them because they're a close-knit group. And the African American advisors and Michelle Obama really want to say yes. And, what they say is there have been so few women on the cover of Vogue, and this is a rare opportunity.
So few black women, I assume you mean.
So few, yeah. So few black women and so few women of color, generally,
okay.
On the cover of Vogue. And they see this as a really rare chance to correct negative stereotypes. They talk about how meaningful it will be for young girls to see the first African American First Lady on the cover of Vogue. So they really want to say yes. There are white advisors, however, who are very worried about the economic climate. And, they know about the public anger over banker bonuses and foreclosure and job loss. And they say, wait a second, Vogue is like a pure luxury magazine. Even to buy it on the newsstand costs something like $5, which is, what a lot of people spend on lunch. And they also said, Michelle Obama, you're a person of substance. Do you really want to be known as America's #1 fashionista? So she decides to do it, and she poses on the cover, and it actually goes fine. It's a very mild story. She doesn't wear, she wears nice clothing, but not terribly expensive clothing, and there's very little criticism. But to me, it really takes us behind the scenes and shows us the complexity of being a role model, because when you're putting yourself out there like that, you have to take so many things into consideration, and you're potentially subject to so much criticism.
Yeah. Now, the book met with some controversy on its initial release. What was that all about?
Well, one of the reasons I was excited to do this discussion with you is that I saw the not to get too blogging head self-referential.
Go right ahead.
I saw the conversation that you did with John McWhorter, which, I hadn't known about beforehand, so I just watched it as a viewer. And one of the things that you were talking about that interested me was the First Lady's comments about, being worried about being portrayed as an angry black woman. That was a surprising moment for me because, first of all, she said she hadn't read the book. And, second of all, as I think you mentioned on the last Blogging Heads video, this is not an unflattering portrait of her. It definitely shows her as a strong, impassioned figure in the White House, but none of my reporting or writing depicts her as, irrational or high maintenance or, manipulative. And also by the standards of prior First Ladies, her behavior is pretty mild, compared to Nancy Reagan, who sometimes acted as her husband's shadow chief of staff. Michelle Obama's reactions, in the White House, I think, are pretty understandable in a lot of ways. I mean, basically, there are a couple of points in the book where she does appear frustrated. But, what aides and advisors said is that she had a lot invested in this presidency, really wanted to see it go well, believes that her husband is a transformative president. So there were moments like, for example, when Scott Brown won in Massachusetts, and it was a pretty severe bungle by the White House political team. That was when, she was frustrated. And interestingly, the way we know about that is not because she confronted her president's aides directly in the White House, but the president said to his staff, Michelle really feels that our rudder isn't great.
Yeah. Well, that's foreshadowed, is it not, by her reaction to the president's loss in that congressional race to Bobby Rush some years earlier, when she felt he had also not been well served by his political people.
Well, it's funny because there's also a great scene in the memoir by David Plouffe, who was the Obama campaign manager
Yes.
in 2008, where he describes the president's loss in Texas and Ohio in the Democratic primaries, and those had involved some miscalculations by Obama's team. And Michelle Obama was, she was clearly displeased, and he describes in the book how, she refused to even talk to him and to her husband because she was, she was really registering her disapproval in a powerful way. So I guess that was, that was part of what was a little surprising to me about the reaction, because even though I was trying to present new information in the book, it was not exactly a state secret that Michelle Obama had sometimes been tough on her husband's team.
Yeah. In fact, the president says that she's, between the two of them, she's the tougher one. And after reading your book,
Yeah.
I'm prepared to believe it, actually. But it certainly is not an unflattering portrait of the First Lady. I want to reaffirm that. It is not, I think, read objectively in any way, an unflattering portrait of her.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, as somebody who's observed her closely, what did you feel that you kind of learned about her from the book that you didn't know?
The degree of discomfort that she had with this role, that's one thing. The running serious debate that she had with her husband about their respective responsibilities within the marriage, and about managing the tensions between the incredible demands of the public life that he had embraced and the very palpable needs of the family that they were trying to raise. Naivete at the beginning, and then prudent adjustment in due course about what was really going to be required here. I don't know. Is this an exam?
No, I'm just really curious.
Can I look at my notes?
I love hearing readers' reactions,
Yeah.
because I think that part of what we're talking about is, the contrast between the very carefully edited public image that every president and first lady has versus, what they're like when the cameras are not on. And the thing I really found in my reporting is that the Michelle Obama who appears in public is not in any way inauthentic. Like when old Chicago friends talk about her image as First Lady, what they say is, we totally recognize, the maternal warmth, the way she connects with audiences, the sort of grace and poise that she has shown as First Lady. They say all of that is very authentic. What they feel has been kind of edited out is more, the force of her advocacy, the fact that she is a pretty naturally frank person who shares her opinions with others. That's the stuff they kind of feel has been missing from the public picture.
Okay, now there was an incident during the campaign in which Michelle said, I guess in some offhand comment, that I can't quote it exactly, for the first time in her adult life, she was genuinely proud of her country, in reference to the fact that the country seemed prepared to embrace her husband's candidacy for president. And, of course, that was seized upon by his political enemies, and she was then caricatured as, quote, an angry black woman, close, a radical black woman who couldn't have been proud of her country until it was prepared to elect a black man. Don't you think that one reason why she might have been a little prickly about the candid reporting in your book is that she lives in a world in which that kind of thing can happen to her?
Oh, absolutely. And, what aides and advisors say about that period was that it was so painful for her to see herself mischaracterized that way. One of her close advisors put it this way to me. She said, Michelle Obama has basically done everything right her whole life, right? She has worked so hard. She studied so hard when she was in school. She's, worked hard to contribute positively to the community, to raise her kids, to be a good wife. And so to see herself represented on the public stage in, this caricatured, inaccurate way. I mean, the thing that actually really sticks in my mind is when Fox ran that crawl of her calling her Barack's baby mama, because I thought,
that one got past
oh
me.
my
I didn't
God.
see that.
I mean, the hours of studying, right, that this woman has put in, the professional accomplishments that she is accumulating.
Wait a minute now, Jodi. I'm sorry, I didn't see this. So
Yeah.
tell me what exactly was said.
It was a minor thing, but it caused a real scandal because Fox News, you know how they have those crawls on the
I
bottom?
do.
They have like the text
Yes.
that appears at the bottom of the TV screen, and so they were talking about Michelle Obama in some way, and they referred to her as Barack's baby
Oh,
mama.
wow.
And so, yeah, exactly. So that was one that was really shocking to me, because it really did seem like no matter how much she accomplished in the world, the fact that she could still be referred to in that way was really surprising. So anyway, back to your original point about her sort of anxiety of being mischaracterized. She had kind of a really bad scare in 2008, and AIDS did work to really kind of polish and buff her image. It's funny, one advisor said, we have to sort of make her more like the mom on the Cosby Show, and I thought it was interesting that, the model they were turning to was a very positive model, but also one
very old model.
Claire Huxtable is a fictional character, right? And she was on TV decades ago.
No.
But so anyway, they really did work to, reporters would probably say reboot her image, advisors would probably say clarify her image, and she became extremely cautious. Aides and advisors in the White House talked about her fear of making a mistake, the terrible knowledge she has to live with, that if she makes a single slip, it can cause days of negative headlines for the administration. If you remember the story from the book, the first summer in the White House, the Obamas went to the Grand Canyon, and they were warned specifically to dress very lightly because of high temperatures on the canyon floor. And so she wore a pair of shorts, not even a fancy pair of shorts, just sort of regular mom shorts. And there were days of coverage and photos and videos and a debate about whether it was okay for the First Lady of the United States to wear a pair of shorts. And she was very contrite. She went to advisors and said, did I mess up? I mean, should I have worn something different? And they said to her, just let it go, because you're going to be picked apart no matter what.
I just wanted to tell you that I was once visiting my father in Florida in a limousine coming from the airport to his home, and the limousine driver, in our casual conversation about politics and so on, made a point of making reference to Michelle Obama appearing in shorts. Yes.
Really?
This is just some Joe driving a car.
I know it is an absurd life in which the wearing of shorts can be a news story, and I thought also was a little bit ironic given Michelle Obama's background, because, this is somebody who was a pretty regular American, right, who did not come from a privileged background. And so I thought that the expectation that, she would become First Lady and sort of not dress like a normal person anymore was really interesting.
One of the things that I found most poignant in your reporting in the book, and it is almost suitable for a Huxtable's episode or something, is this African-American first family sitting around in the White House being served by a largely older African-American, long-serving White House staff, and wanting not to be, I can get that for myself, please don't bother, or whatever, and people insisting on formality. And then Michelle's mother, Marion Robinson, not wanting to appear on Oprah because she can still go out and, shop at a Filene's basement or something, and people won't recognize her, but if she goes on television, they will. And
the thing she said when she turned down that Oprah interview request, what she said is that the people at Filene's just assume that she works in the executive meaning, and they're not talking, they don't think she's the chief of staff. They they think she does some sort of housekeeping job or something in the White House.
So the clash of worlds.
Right. I agree with you. I think that's one of the kind of everyday experiences of the presidency that is poignant. The person who described that to me is Marty Nesbitt, one of the President ladies and First Lady's close friends, and he was describing, he has a very similar background to them. He's a very successful African-American guy, comes from a very working class background, and he said to me, he looks at the White House staff, and as you say, they're these elderly African-Americans, and he said, I feel like I know these people. They're my heroes. My mom worked parties, doing kind of catering jobs to get me through college. And so what he was saying was that it was a little bit funny for them to be waited on by people they almost felt like family. Michelle Obama, when she went to Princeton, one of her aunts was a housemaid in the town. And here she is, she's going to school with people who went to Choate and Exeter and Andover, and her family's from a totally different background.
Can I shift the gears a little bit? Our time is getting short, and I want to ask you about the Valerie Jarrett relationship to the Obamas, the role she plays in the White House. I will say, having read your book, that she doesn't come off as well as she might have done in it, doesn't come off looking as well as she might have done. And I'm just wondering, who is Valerie Jarrett? What's the nature of this relationship? How has she fared as a top presidential advisor over this first term, and so on? Would you care to comment for the public consumption on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I tried to portray both the sort of positive side and then also the slightly problematic side of Valerie Jarrett's role. What's so unique about her is that she is the person connected to kind of every aspect of the Obamas' lives. She's a Chicagoan. She mentored them in Chicago. She's from one of the city's best established, really groundbreaking African-American families. My favorite quote about her is that somebody who knows her well told me that Valerie is the mother of all of our ambition, meaning she kind of epitomizes the sort of African-American dream of achievement and breaking barriers and being first. And she got to the White House with the Obamas, and she serves a very complex kind of multi-tiered role in the White House. She's a West Wing advisor. She has a portfolio that involves, for example, a lot of outreach. She's also one of Michelle Obama's closest advisors and part of the glue between the East Wing.
Now that's unprecedented. Is it? I'm sorry to interrupt, but just to establish, I can't think of any previous case where you had someone who was both a serious policy advisor in the West Wing, but also a close personal confidant of the First Lady in the East Wing.
And a very close friend of theirs. I mean, they even vacationed together, like on some of the Obama's Hawaii trips. Valerie Jarrett has gone along. There's a familial, aspect. I once interviewed Michelle Obama about Valerie, and Mrs. Obama alternated between mother and sister analogies when describing Valerie, which I thought was very telling. So Valerie is in the White House performing a kind of number of functions, and in a way, I think her performance is very hard to evaluate because the true nature of her bond and influence is so private with the Obamas. I mean, you could, talk about, okay, this is, sort of her outreach function and how she's performed here, or here's a particular project, that she worked on there. But, ultimately what you're really talking about is somebody who is very much a private counselor to them. No, so the place where that raised some tensions in the White House is that it has to do with two things. This is not a president who has a traditional management hierarchy in the West Wing. He's now on his third chief of staff, and there have been concerns over time that instead of really having a kind of clear organizational chart where everything goes through the chief of staff, he has several high-level advisors who have a lot of influence. It's almost like there are several chiefs of staff, and Valerie is among them and doesn't necessarily, kind of fit into the traditional place in the organization. And then the second thing the second thing that people kind of worry about with her is that there is this fear or concern sometimes with other members of the team of, what are they talking about privately? What is Valerie telling them? If I tell her things, is she going to repeat them? Now, a lot of her colleagues really trust and respect her. She's formed great working relationships with a lot of people in the White House. When I reported my book, the kind of shocking thing is that Robert Gibbs, the first press secretary, really went on the record with a lot of intense kind of accusations against her, saying that she was manipulative and promoted herself at the expense of others and wasn't an honest broker in the way that she communicated with the Obamas and then back to the staff. Other staff members really disagreed with that and said that she did a great job of compartmentalizing her role.
I see. But there is a tension, is there not, in that I'm thinking, of course, the president has to assume when he's talking with advisors that when he makes off the cuff or unguarded statements that they will be private and not leaked to the press. But at the same time, the advisors have to assume when they're talking among each other out of the president's earshot, that as they explore ideas or counter and thrust and so on, or maybe even disagree with what the president, that won't come back to the president through a back channel, thereby undermining their perception of his confidence in them. So her relationship at a personal level, and then the professional responsibilities of a top policy advisor with a team of advisors are inherently in conflict, are they not?
I also think that Valerie, in a way almost embodies some of the big questions and tensions of this presidency, because she's the highest level African-American advisor in the White House and often is the person who deals with matters of race. So that's a very delicate, complicated portfolio to deal with. Second of all, she is a kind of diplomat on behalf of a very introverted president, and that's a hard role to play because people are always going to want to talk to the president of the United States himself. Third of all, this is, in the presidency, there's such a big question of what is public and what is private, right, and where that line falls. And because Valerie is both a kind of private friend, and then also this West Wing advisor, I think she kind of embodies, some of that confusion and questioning over that issue.
Yeah.
And the last thing to say about Valerie is that, like the Obamas, she is a newcomer to Washington.
Yeah.
She was a real estate executive in Chicago, so just as they've made this enormous leap, she's made an enormous leap as well.
Rahm Emanuel opposed the idea of her playing a top policy advisory role, did he not?
He did. He tried to get her to take Obama's old Senate seat, and that created some complications with Rod Blagojevich, as you will remember. But he was very opposed to the idea of bringing such a close personal friend in at a very high level in the White House.
Now, one of the stories you reported, speaking of Emanuel, that I found shocking was that Christopher Edley, who is the dean of the Bolt Hall Law School at Berkeley and who was Dukakis's issue manager during the 1988 presidential campaign, who is
and also worked in the
Clinton White House, and happened to have been a classmate at Swarthmore College of my late wife back in the early 70s, and is someone that I know pretty well, sent a note upon learning that Rahm Emanuel had been chosen for chief of staff to the president, saying he didn't think it was a good idea. And you report that the two, President Obama and Edley, haven't spoken since.
Yeah,
I was stunned by that.
I know. Well, it's interesting that the surprising thing is.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jodi. I should mention that Chris Edley is an African American. I should have mentioned that, but go on.
So Chris, To me, what was surprising was the way the president, he was then the president-elect, reacted to what Edley was saying. I mean, Edley had warned Obama about Emanuel for a couple of reasons, one of which turned out to be kind of prescient. His concern was that because Emanuel had spent so long getting Democrats elected to Congress, that was really Emanuel's life's work in the years before he came to the White House, that there would be a kind of tension in the presidency because Emanuel would be so protective of Democrats from kind of swing districts, that it would be hard for him to fully carry out the presidential agenda because sometimes the president needs to make members of Congress do very difficult things. And in fact, even colleagues very close to Emanuel said that did eventually turn out to be a real problem. And Edley kind of predicted it, but when he sent that note to the president, and I should say he sent it the day after Election Day. So picture Barack Obama in Chicago, just having won the presidential election, just having decided to make Emanuel his chief of staff. And Edley sends a note not saying you did the wrong thing, but saying, okay, if Emanuel is going to be your chief of staff, here are some recommendations I have about how to organize your White House to kind of multiply Emanuel's strengths and compensate for one of his weaknesses. And so Edley gets a phone call from Valerie Jarrett saying, Obama's really furious, you're going to get a phone call. And then Obama calls Edley and really lays into him, according to Edley. And according, the flavor of the conversation, Chris says, was, a kind of, why do you have to criticize me sort of today of all days after I've just won the presidential election? So there we see an Obama who is, obviously under a lot of pressure to move forward immediately with his selections and really doesn't want to hear dissent at that point.
Yeah. But, Edley is no radical, out-eyed Cornel West type figure. I mean, Edley is an establishment guy with a long professional career at the top of the Democratic Party politics, and, that the president would cut him off because he offered a word of criticism strikes me as revealing, I must say.
Well, there's this pattern in the administration where sometimes the president and his top advisors can act a little bit harsh or defensive towards allies and liberal and progressive allies. I mean, we've all heard those stories again and again. They're trying to repair the breach going into the 2012 election. But, sometimes there can be this tone coming from the president or top advisors that's almost like, can't you see how hard I'm trying? And, I'm being attacked so hard by conservatives.
Right.
Can you please just sort of get with the program and understand what I'm trying to do?
Yeah, understandable, but it could be counterproductive at times too. It seems to me, that attitude. Anyway, Jodi, I think perhaps we would terminate this conversation, having covered a lot of ground. I'm really grateful for you for coming on and talking about the book. Anything further that you want to say before we close?
No, just thank you for having me, and I really appreciate the thoughtful conversation.
What's next for you? Are you continuing to cover the First Family or moving on to other things?
I'll be back to the Times in a couple of days, and so I don't have my story list laid out yet, but I expect to be very involved in the Washington coverage and the coverage of the 2012 race.
Well, yeah, it's going to be a great year for all of us who are in the business of talking about what's going on in American public life. What an exciting campaign we have to look forward to.
I agree.
All right, well, have a good day, and thanks again so much for doing this.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.